Hey guys, and welcome back to Time Under Tension. Today we are kicking off a new series. We just wrapped up our series on transitions, having just personally experienced our transition from North Carolina and the big move to Arizona and kind of settling into life here. If you haven't checked that series out yet, definitely do. It's not just about moving, it's about being able to thrive through any kind of transition in your life, whether that's a new job or a new relationship, just kind of redefining yourself and learning to find your security and your flow and your rootedness in the midst of a lot of life transition, which I think we all experience at some point or another in life. But this week, we're kicking off a new series, and it will be on one of our favorite topics, relationships. So tell me, this is something where when I brought it up, it sounded like it was something you were pretty like interested in initially, and I'm curious why this topic resonates with you.
Yeah, I think honestly, after COVID, which was really, we just had this transition conversation, but it was the biggest transition for me personally in my own life. And it had everything to do with relationships, from relationships with other people, relationships to God, relationships to food, relationships to my body. I just had this massive realization that everything is a relationship. We have a relationship with everything. And I know on this specific section that we're going to be diving into, it's about relationships with other people or with your significant other, with God. But that massive realization of how, when we do dive into this, understanding how we're relating to one another, how we relate to the people around us, and the practices that go with that can absolutely be transferred into relationships that you have with everything else, relationships to your work life balance, relationships to your dog. Like, relationships are all around us, relationships to nature and to the world. And that's what got me so excited, was not only my deep desire to share my testimony in my personal growth in relationships, especially romantic relationships, but also just understanding how this particular section that we're about to dive into could really impact how a single person could change all of the relationships that they have in their life.
I love that you differentiated between different types of relationships, but
Yeah.
really that clarification that everything is a relationship. And one thing that we know from science is in isolation, no no species thrives, right? I think they've done like fly studies, and when you isolate a fly, it dies very quickly. And it's the same for people. Like, we do not do well in isolation, which I think is at the root of a lot of the struggle around COVID and the isolation that came with that. But if relationships are so important, which seems to be evidenced by the fact that we really can't live and certainly not thrive without them, then it's really important that it's not just about having relationships, but about having healthy relationships. And I think kind of tackling what that looks like and knowing that although some relationships are different, like, yeah, I tend to have a lot more grace and patience with my dog than I do with other people sometimes. There's still some themes that we have. And if we practice certain behavior in a relationship, it's gonna kinda show up across the board in our relationship. So I think it's really important to kinda get down to how we establish healthy relationships in general because it will translate to, like, a lot of different areas of our life.
Yeah, I think relationships are the biggest mirror. They really help us to reflect on our own values, what's important to us. We were just having this conversation last night in that group that we were with, about how it's not, when you're in an argument, and we can definitely dive into this later, but this is just an example of how it's super reflective, is when you're in an argument about unpacking a suitcase that's been out for a couple of days, it's not about unpacking the suitcase or the suitcase still being out there on the ground. There's a much deeper value system that each one of us holds, that particular things that cause that irritation or that agitation is really pointing us to something much deeper. In having a very clear environment makes me feel more calm, for example, with the suitcase. Or the other person might just be like, I just haven't gotten around to it. It's not really a priority for me. So two people are missing completely because it's much deeper than that. There's values that are being miscommunicated or misaligned in the relationship that's leading to this tension about this thing that's really actually quite irrelevant. So I just wanted to share that example because of how powerful relationships are in their reflective nature, in the mirror that they are. But I want to ask you, you were the one that came up with this. You were the one that knew you wanted to dive into a relationship series. And yeah, I got super excited, but what was it about relationships for you that really made you feel like this would be a very significant topic to cover?
I think it's something that I've learned a lot about in the past 2 years, probably. I mean, throughout our lives, we learn a lot about relationships, but it's different to learn how to manage relationships. Like, we all kinda learn how to function in relationships in some capacity, but to actually, like, thrive in a relationship is very different, and the closer that you and I get over time, the more that I have realized how important it is to really consciously and proactively examine and define your patterns and boundaries within a relationship. Because the things that, as a coach, I always tell people for fitness, it's like the things that you practice are the things that you solidify. So, like, if you're completing an exercise with poor form, you're gonna solidify that. Like, okay, 1 week here and there where you're like, I'm gonna, like, try a weight I maybe shouldn't," and then your back is just, like, all rounded on your deadlift, and we all cringe a little and look away and be like, great PR." But then the next week, you better freaking back off the weight and dial it back in, and that happens. It happens in relationships where there's gonna be an off week where it's like, "Ooh, I didn't quite show up the way that I wanted to. I didn't stay true to my commitment to this person, whether that's like I was going to go to this event for them and I kind of backed out last minute, or, I told you that I would do the laundry before you got home and then I didn't. And I kind of like let myself down in that way because I didn't uphold my commitments. Um, but that is a learning opportunity. It's like, all right, I kind of push the boundaries or the bounds of like what is acceptable for me and my standards within a relationship and maybe like your expectations for me. Now it's time to kind of dial back in. And sometimes that's not something we're completely aware of, which is where communication comes in. And we'll kind of talk about that in a later episode. But I think kind of learning how it's really important to be very, I think proactive is the best word I can really think of. And the reason that I'm using that is because, like, for those of you who don't know, I was married for several years. I always forget how long the years are, seriously, but I was with someone for 8 years and we got married along the line and we were married for several years. And I found that I'm super, like, I tend to be pretty avoidant and I'm very, like, independent in a lot of ways where I just kinda like to do my thing and get my work done and, like, prioritize what I need to get done, and I'm just a very, like, work-focused person, and so in a relationship, I'm kind of like, yeah, like, it's nice when I wanna spend time together, we can spend time together, and then the rest of the time, I kinda just wanna be, like, left alone to do what I want, and then if you, like, make a big deal about us not spending time together or whatever, it's just all kind of like an inconvenience to me. So that was how I functioned in that relationship previously, and I kind of leaned into the fact that I would be in a nursing role that had me working nights and kind of on the opposite schedule of him so that I could have a lot of time to myself. And then once I was in a relationship with you, I realized that a lot of my old patterns were not gonna work if I wanted this relationship to work. Yes, our relationship is different, but I couldn't expect that just because I'm with a new person, like, all the patterns that I had struggled through in the past were, like, his fault, and would just be gone now. It's like a lot of it came from my behavior and my patterns. And I had to start like unraveling that and realizing how little I communicate, how I tend to be like hyper independent sometimes to the degree of like not being like collaborative with my partner, not communicating clearly. So this topic really resonates with me because it's changed my life, especially as someone who really saw myself as being very like strong and independent and don't need no man or woman to whatever. Like I want to just do everything on my own, and then if you want to like do life by my side, that's cool. That was how I was before. And now that I'm learning like, oh, there's this beautiful like symbiosis within a relationship where we can help each other and play off each other's strengths, but also like you said, like mirror back to each other our values and how we may need to change. I've grown so much as a person that I think it would be really helpful for more people to kind of understand what does this look like and like what are some tangible skills and communication patterns and things that you can use so that you can grow as a person by kind of leveraging all these amazing opportunities you have in every relationship in your life.
Mm, mhm. I have a follow-up question, if that's okay. Is that cool with you?
Yeah, definitely.
In in the transition period, since we just came from that, was there a period of time where you entered into the new relationship, knew it was different and knew it wasn't going to work, and that was the thing that made you aware of it being a little bit more of your patterns of behavior or things that you were doing that weren't necessarily allowing that cohesion or that symbiosis that you talked about? Or were these patterns that you were aware of and weren't able to communicate prior?
Definitely not aware of.
Okay.
I knew that
Mhm.
I had made mistakes in my past relationship, but I was kind of tying those into more like events, decisions, specific
Mhm.
like moments in time along the timeline.
Mhm.
I wasn't really aware of how my patterns, like my day-to-day patterns and communication style was playing into how those bigger issues ended up coming up. And I really
Mm.
wasn't for a long time within our relationship either. I think for a long time I kind of thought like because I tend to like in my mind deal with things on my own, which I realize is a lot of times not dealing with things at all. You
Mhm.
know, when things would come up, I'd be like, why is this a big deal? Like, I don't really understand why this is a big deal. And, I think it was just very, very gradual that I started to realize like how much my own patterns play into and really cause the struggles that I face in my life. And so those, of course, are going to show up in
Mhm.
my relationship. I think it probably started with more of the awareness of like, um, my patterns in my like personal struggles. So I would always speak to myself very negatively and kind of pay more attention to where I was falling short and where I felt like I was failing and where I felt like I wasn't living up to the bar that I had set. And because I was always paying attention to that, I was like gathering evidence that I was inadequate. And that would
Mhm.
lead me then to kind of self sabotage in areas and allowing fear to hold me back from facing a lot of the challenges in my life. But then I would spend way more time being afraid than actually facing the thing. And then I would end up in these situations where I had to make a like last minute decision and I didn't know what to do and I felt out of control. And then I would start to lean on my coping patterns because I fell out of control. And I would just see that pattern on repeat over and over and over. So I think it took kind of realizing how much that happened in my own life before I started
Mhm.
thinking, oh, maybe a lot of the things that I'm doing are
Mhm.
contributing to the patterns that I'm seeing in our relationship. I know
Mhm.
we both contribute. Like we've had to talk a lot about like, hey, when I say this, this is what I mean, or I know it sounds like this when I say this, and that's not what I mean. So that's important. But a lot was like, okay, what am I doing to start this? Like, what's the reaction pattern that I have that's contributing to a lot of times like a recurrent issue. Because I think we
Mhm.
learn the same lessons over and over on deeper levels. So if you're in a relationship and you keep running into the same argument or the same situation, I think it's really important to stop blaming your partner and step back and realize, like, okay, what things did I do leading up to this situation? Like, you're
Mhm.
not blaming you, not blaming your partner. You're just stepping back and getting curious and asking, like,
Yep.
okay, what like sequence of events keeps leading to this same issue?
Definitely, and you hit exactly on the point I was hoping you're gonna hit on, is that this does not happen overnight, or you just are all of a sudden good at relationships or however you wanna phrase that, or learning what it is that's contributing to a struggle in a relationship. And also along those lines, most of the time, there is some self-reflection that needs to happen that leads to the ability to compromise and the ability to understand that there are things that are patterns that are showing up in multiple relationships, including the one with yourself, that probably means that there's something that you're doing that needs to be adjusted. And I just really love so much that you said both of those things because I think it's so important to understand that patience is going to be key in all of this, but also being able to look at your own self and understand from a self awareness level reactions or similar patterns that are happening in your own personal journey, that self-awareness is going to be the thing that unlocks the ability to truly show up and love your partner or love someone else in a situation because you are able to be the expert on you first and understand that there's going to be things that both people have to work on. I just loved that. I think that was like a huge, huge point to make before we dive into this relationship series because not pointing out the fact that self-awareness and I don't know if you wanna say, like, I need to check myself, like, that needs to happen for growth to happen, for the awareness of how you or myself could be contributing to the reoccurring issue. And I just that's exactly what I wanted to really point out, so I think that response was really awesome.
I think one of the main things that helped shift my mindset around this gradually again, and that, like you said, it's super important. Like, this is not overnight, and the patterns that we establish in all of our relationships. I was actually talking to a client about even our relationship with ourselves, especially because we had such a long relationship with ourselves. We've practiced these patterns, so it's going to take a lot of practice to establish new patterns, and that's
Right.
just something that takes patience. But there's a psychologist named John Gottman, and he has like the Gottman Institute for like relationships, and they've done like a ton of research. And he talks about some really great concepts that I'd like to get into in some of the later episodes in this series. But one was the idea of like it's us versus the problem. And he talks about like a couple that's functioning well sees the problem as like this beach ball, right, that you guys have between you and you're like addressing it together. But in a dysfunctional relationship, you see the beach ball in your partner and you're like, you're the problem, right? And I think in another way, and I've definitely fallen into this category as well, seeing the beach ball in yourself and you're like, I'm the problem, I'm causing all these issues. It's like, no, no, no. Step back and say, like, okay, all right, we've got this problem between us. Let's figure out how to tackle it like a team and really become more effective in the way that we communicate so we can kind of knock this out and just get back to like the fun that we have together and how much we do love being together, which I think has been helpful. But one thing I do want to note is like if you're in a really just collaborative relationship, hopefully both of you are willing and ready to tackle this problem together.
Mhm.
I think sometimes though there's situations where like one or the other is more willing to like meet the other person in the middle. And sometimes it does not end up being in the middle because of that. Like this person's willing to go this far and this person's kind of like, like meet me farther. I'm demanding more right now. over time, hopefully that gets more to middle ground. But initially, if you're really wanting to work on relationships in your life, you might be more willing than the other person. But I want to encourage you, like, don't let that stop you from trying and getting started with it. Because what I've learned is there's been times when, like, I feel like you've been more willing to, like, go above and beyond for me than I have. I've just been like, I'm kind of in my, like, I just want to sulk and not get through my crap. And you're like, just really trying and trying and trying. And there's been opposite where I'm like, I feel like I'm really like reaching out to you. Gottman calls it like bids for connection. Like I'm throwing out bids for connection and I don't really feel like you're coming back to me with it. But like what I've learned is over time, it does kind of you start seeing my patterns and meeting me there and vice
Mhm.
versa. Like if I see you really showing up for me, even if I'm being like really stubborn, like there's been some times where I'm like, I've been trying so much and I don't feel like you are. And so I'm just gonna like sit here and wait for you to come to me. And you do, and you keep doing it. And then I'm like, I gotta let down my guard and just love you because that's really all I want to do. So there's gonna be times like that where one or the other of you are stubborn. I just want to encourage you, like, again, don't let that stop you from starting to incorporate some of these skills and tools and strategies that we're going to talk about because you're making that bid for the connection and you don't even know how your partner might come back to you. And maybe just giving that, taking that one step farther than them in love will will trigger them to say, oh, I actually want that love too. Like I want to give you that love too. There's a difference when it's like an abusive relationship and it's very one-sided and you're always the person giving, 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 and that person's taking from you all the time. So it's really important, I think, before we get into this discussion, to differentiate between like healthy ambivalence within a relationship and like toxic one-sidedness.
Mhm. Yeah, I love that we're kind of giving a brief overview of like all these different things we're gonna hash out along this series. I think for me, with you sharing like that was kind of a big aha moment for you. And my background in relationships is just a lot different than yours. We're extremely almost opposite, if you want to say it that way. I know you just mentioned you were in, 7, 8 year marriage and you're 26,
7.
right? 27. So you got married 20, like to think about that, to give people some context, like you were married young and didn't experience as many relationships as me, not for any other reason than you found that partner pretty young, and you got committed pretty early. So in your journey, you were with one person for a long period of time and had a completely different journey of finding your patterns and working through the things that you noticed about yourself, but also those repeat patterns in the relationship. And it was just such a different journey. Mine was a lot more like I started dating when I was really young. I came out when I was 12 and had been in multiple relationships leading up to COVID, where for the first time since I was 12, I was actually single and spent quality time getting really rooted in my spirituality and really rooted in God. And that in itself, I kind of call it a sabbatical, but essentially I was single and working on myself for those 10 to 11 months. And in that period of time was where I really was able to understand just how unaware I was of my own self in relationships and how much I mistreated the people I was with, if you wanna say that way. I was never an abusive individual, but I was not loyal. I had been a loyal individual in relationships in the past, and it wasn't until then that I had realized all of the fears and all of the you say you're a little bit more of an independent person, and that's kind of your attachment style. I was more of like, the second things start to get serious, this is a little too vulnerable for me and I'm just not sure how to deal with this, so I'm out. And so there was like throughout my relationship to relationship to relationship, like for so long, it led to my biggest point that I wanna make before we enter into this is, like, don't think that you can't change in relationships, like, just because you have a past, you can absolutely change how you engage in relationships, not just with yourself, but with your romantic partners and with the people around you. There is a level of self-awareness that you can gain and gather, and you truly can transform and change. There are so many individuals that could speak to my infidelity and my, consistent going out, and I wasn't problem solving, and it wasn't really ever my fault, and, it was always on my time and what I wanted to do, and that is super heavy to carry. To forgive myself for that took I'm still working through that, to be totally transparent a little bit. It's really this relationships that this relationship and the way I have shown up for you and the way that you've shown up for me that has shown me just how much, one, I have transformed and changed, but also how hard relationships can be, but how fulfilling that hard work is. And so in this love that I'm now experiencing with you, I'm able to see, like, all of the ways that I treated the people that I was with before. It was so not right, and it's not the person I wanna be, and absolutely I mean, you can speak to it obviously because 'cause you're dating me now, but I'm a completely different person, and it has brought this level of fruitfulness and this ability to transform my light in the way that I show up and break these fears and these patterns, and it's helped me to show up as the truest version of self, my best version of self. And so the reason I share that is just because you hear a lot of people say that people can't change. And you hear, often that once a cheater, always a cheater, things like that. And that if you are willing to put in the work to change, if you know that you're created to love somebody, then forgive yourself for what you've done. Ask the people that you've hurt to forgive you, like, definitely own up, say you're sorry, own up to your mistakes, don't hide it, but also don't feel shame for that. Don't judge yourself anymore, just start now and absolutely start to change your behavior, change what you believe, and start engaging in your relationship with the other person that you truly wanna love, and be vulnerable enough to get there, because it's gonna be hard work, yes, but you're gonna learn so much about yourself that's gonna absolutely transform your entire life from a joyful, abundant place, and also help you to understand how to truly connect with another person. It's the most fruitful experience I've had in my entire life, and I just really felt like I needed to share that because there are so many people I've met that just think they can't change and think that they're always gonna be how they are, and it's like, no, in every single moment, you absolutely have a decision, just like you spoke about. There's a decision to push stop and put the beach ball over here, and the 2 of us can look at the beach ball together instead of immediately placing that beach ball on the other person and just deciding that that's it. Like, every single moment, we have a choice to decide to show up as the person we wanna be or show up as the same person we were out of fear. Um, and to me, it's, like, deeply, deeply rooted in my transformation and in my testimony with God. So, trusting that there is goodness inside, and even if you've been a particular person in relationships, you can always be the person you wanna be and show up as the person you wanna show up as.
Definitely. You know, as a coach, like, one of the things I try to do is keep the person's goals in the forefront of their mind. Like, it's easy to kind of, when we have that initial meeting, to say, "All right, here's the goal. Like, I wanna lose weight." I'm like, "Okay, well, why do you wanna lose weight?" And it's like, "Okay, well, actually, I really wanna be able to play softball with my niece when she comes into town. Like, I wanna feel strong and stable enough to do that." That's a big goal, right? That's going right at the top of your timeline because I want you coming back to that every time you run into an obstacle, every time you start questioning, why are we doing this? Why am I on a diet? Why do I have to do cardio every day? It's like, I'm playing softball with my niece. And that's a big why. It's the same for your relationship. You got to remember the why. Like, what is it that you really want? It's like, do you want a deep, loving, stable connection with your best friend? That's what I want. But if I don't keep that goal at the forefront of my mind, little diversional goals, which for me would be like, I want to be right, would come in and take place of that in an acute situation. So if we're in a discussion and I want to be right and I want my feelings to be validated and I let that take over, that's going to totally shift the way I interact. Whereas if I say, okay, wait, pause, I want us to be in a really loving and committed and cohesive relationship in which we both feel safe and both feel empowered to be our best selves, which means I may not always be right, but you have to understand that there's a goal that's driving your behavior in the relationship. And if you want to have a great relationship, you need to find a way to remind yourself of that ultimate goal because that may mean laying aside some of the like ego and pride driven little goals that creep in like needing to be right or needing to prove a point because a lot of times that's not going to matter as much and that's certainly not going to lead to a great relationship if that's always your primary goal.
Yeah, and I think a great point that you mentioned in there too is like in relationships, there are things that when we experience trauma, like you mentioned earlier about surviving and thriving, we have these patterns of protection. So being right might be this protection mechanism in a way. You're needing to be right because when you weren't right before, it led to this. And, it can show up like that too. So I love that you pointed that out because mine is definitely not to be right. It's that I need to feel like I'm equal to this person or like my struggle before was like if I feel like I could lose that person or that they're not scared to lose me, then all of a sudden I could be left at any moment. And I'm like, I'm insecure at that point. I don't feel secure in the relationship. And that's when I start to act out. That's when I'm starting to do these things like these little fights come up. But the only way I know if someone cares is if they're willing to fight for me. So it's like once we realize where our survival patterns are coming in and we're feeling like we need to protect ourselves, that awareness really points out, okay, no, there's a fear there. And if you can communicate that with your partner instead of act on being right or like, well, that means we need to go out and I'm not really going to pay much attention because I need this person to know that they could lose me at any second. Like, it's like whatever your thing is, there's something there that is usually rooted in some sort of inner fear that if this particular thing happens, now you're in survival mode instead of like me telling you, hey, sometimes I get insecure and I want to feel like you come to me when you're struggling with things every now and then because that'll make me feel like I'm adding value to the relationship or like can you just open up a little bit more? I'm a type 2 and I really love to help. So if I feel like you need me sometimes, that really helps me in a healthy way address that part of me that's feeling like it needs to put up its protectors and try to survive in this moment.
Definitely. And that goes back to these patterns that are super deeply rooted
Yeah.
in why I think self-reflection is like so key in this. And again, why I'm saying like whether or not you're in a romantic relationship right now or not, like working on your role and your behaviors and patterns and communication styles within relationships will serve you across the board in your life. So don't wait to get started on working on these skills and starting that kind of self-reflection. And we're going to get into that in the next few episodes. Um, and really get started now because it's going to take practice. So you might as well get going. And you have opportunity every single day to practice it, which is really exciting. So you can make a lot of progress really quickly and start to see just how quickly your life will turn around when you start kind of addressing some of your patterns and realizing that there's a lot of fear driving what you're doing for the most part. And when we learn to take that power from fear to more like proactive determination of the direction that we want to go, you start to feel a lot more fulfilled and like autonomous in your own life, which is super. I mean, it just makes your life way more enjoyable as a whole.
Yeah, the last thing I'm gonna say about that is that period of time that I had where I was alone and single helped me to realize just how much I was trying to fill that empty void with another person. So just, romantic relationships absolutely, in my personal experience, have exploded the colorfulness of the world around me. Life is so much better with you. But at the same time, you need to also understand that this person is not going to be your fulfillment or be the reason that you all of a sudden find joy in your life. Like, you're doing life next to that person and with that person, but you are a whole by yourself, and you having the ability to truly love who you are, find how you can show up as your own healer, how you can be the one that sits with the emotions, those parts of you that feel those things. That's going to be key, because if you're relying so heavily on this person to be the thing that's going to heal you, or um, fix a problem that's a personal shame cycle or something going on inside, that's not the case, and that can really hurt our relationship. I Trust me, we'll talk about it. I know. It is a lot of understanding that to be committed to another person, you have to be strong, stable, and committed to the relationship you have with yourself first.
Totally.
Yeah.
Absolutely, and I think that's why I'm glad we haven't talked about this. We've talked about a lot of other self-work leading into this series, and I would recommend that if you haven't listened to previous episodes, definitely do, because you want that foundation first before you start getting into this. I'm not saying don't work on relationships now, but like Dee said, the relationships aren't going to fill the hole, and you have to start with some level of self-awareness if you really wanna,
Mhm.
like, thrive in this area. So make sure that you're kind of looking at yourself as a whole, how you function in your relationship with self, just as much as how you're functioning in your relationships with other people, because there's a lot of interplay between the two.
Totally agree.
So this was like full intro, a lot of little sneak peeks into what's to come. We wanted to kind of give you guys an idea of where we're headed with this, but I'm excited. This is going to be a loaded series. Not next episode, but we will be doing an episode in this series that's a Q&A. So stay tuned on our Instagrams for that. We're going to release like the question, get all your answers, and then kind of address some of your case studies and questions on the episode. So definitely connect with us on there. Our Instagrams are in the show notes below. Also, if you're interested in starting a podcast, you can follow the link in the description to create your own through Buzzsprout, which is the platform that we use. It's super easy and connects to like all major streaming services. You can get a discount there and support the show, which is super exciting.
Awesome. I
So
have one last thing. Is that okay?
yeah, for sure.
If I can share one thing from anything that we have just talked about, the single most important thing in my mind is to listen. Just listen. If you're in an argument, if you're talking, whatever, close your mouth. If your other person is talking, give them a talking stick. Literally, it sounds small. Listening, active listening is 100% going to absolutely change the entire dynamic. If one person can say exactly how they're feeling, the other person is not trying to defend, they're just listening. That's going to allow for this space to have a lot more calm and a lot more ability to actually process and speak in more of a discussion way than an angry, battle. Just listen. That's it. Listen. That's my
I
only thing.
love you said
Active
active
listening.
listening,
Yeah.
which means you're not planning your response and calculating how you feel while the other person is talking. It means you're literally
Exactly.
turning off your little thought spiral and just focusing in on what the person's saying and remembering like in a in a healthy collaborative relationship, it requires that you're really taking in what the other person is saying with an open heart, which is super challenging sometimes, but it's just it's so rewarding, and that's, like, the foundation for, creating, like, a symbiotic relationship. Alright, guys, thanks for listening. Please remember to like, subscribe, stay tuned for next week. We'll be digging into this more, giving you some tangible takeaways so you can thrive in your relationships, and we will catch you next week on Time Under Tension.